And then when I was doing my PhD, this is in Holland, that's where part of my accent is from. I also started to work with a professional cycling team, this team here. In those days were very different. So now we associate cycling with like something that has a very scientific approach, and they think very carefully about the nutrition. In those days, it was very different. It was very conservative sport, and no one liked change. So it's changed, obviously, a lot since then. So I then went, I spent a little bit of time in the US, and then I ended up at this place, this University of Birmingham here, where for a long time I was the head of the Human Performance Lab. And we did a lot of studies looking at nutrition, trying to come up with ways to influence the guidelines and improve the guidelines. So what I want to do today is talk to you about sort of this whole process, this journey over maybe like almost 20 years, I think, of doing research, because that was the basis of what's gone into NeverSecond. And so I think it's important to understand what is behind those products before I then show you what the products are and what they are supposed to do. So I then spent also a few, like after my academic career, in 2011, I was head of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute for a little while. And I picked this photo because this was the lab here on the left at IMG Academies, and we had several labs around the world. This was like the newest one in Florida, but we also had labs in near Chicago, in Barrington, in Brazil, in Mexico, in the UK. But in that role, there were three things that were important: research, to make sure that we were at the forefront of things; education, so that people actually know how to use the products; and then helping athletes actually use this. And this is what I do at the moment. I have a consulting company. I work with athletes, and some of these have been mentioned already. But these are some of the clients that I work with at the moment. Over time, just skipped three slides. Over the time, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of athletes in very different sports, athletes with very big names. And you can see in the picture behind me is that was one of my best experiences, working with Haile Gebrselassie, who's won medals at World Championships in every distance between 1500 meters and the marathon, 27 world records, and a very special sort of person. And working with some of these athletes, I've always listened very well, and I try to learn from these athletes. Hopefully they learn something from me sometimes as well, but I learned a lot from them, and I learned how to ask the right questions, which I then took into the lab, and we started to investigate this at the university. So I will talk about a couple of these athletes in my slides as I move on. So triathlon was my sport for the last few years. You can see Chrissie Wellington here, 4-time world champion. In a training session here in Hawaii. For one, we competed together in Hawaii several years. I just as an age grouper, and she competed for the win. But this is where my passion was. And now the last project that I've worked on is very exciting, NeverSecond project, because now I can use all of the experience and the knowledge that is gained over like more than 25 years and turn it into a product that people actually use. And of course, I believe now this is the best product on the market with everything that has gone into it. So from now on, it's going to be a science talk. This is an overview of the recommendations that we have for carbohydrate intake during exercise. And I'm going to show you some of the studies that we've done that have resulted in these recommendations. But first, I'm going to explain to you what this graph shows. On the horizontal axis, you can see the duration of exercise here from 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to longer. On the vertical axis, you can see like the amounts of carbohydrates. So initially, if the exercise, for example, here is between 1 and 2 hours, we recommend an intake around 30 grams per hour. If it's between 2 and 3, 60 grams an hour. And then if it's longer than 3 hours or maybe even 2.5 hours, you should consider 90 grams an hour. That's a lot of carbohydrate. And especially when we first started to do this research and athletes were taking maybe at best 20 to 25 grams of carbohydrate per hour, even in a Tour de France, for example. Like when you then suggest, well, maybe instead of the 25 grams per hour, you should take 90 grams an hour, everyone thought that, that I was crazy. So what we'll talk about is like, how did we get to this? And where does the 90 grams an hour, where does that come from? And in order to achieve that, what should the products look like? This is like a really sort of classical study. As you can see that the year it was published was 1986, long time ago, but it showed that if you take carbohydrate during exercise, that it helps you to maintain your blood glucose. If you just ingest water or a placebo, your blood sugar goes down. And after a while, it goes down to such low levels that you start to feel lightheaded, very well known as bonking. And of course, that is a disaster for your performance. This is why in this study, they couldn't exercise longer than 3 hours, 180 minutes. But with carbohydrate, they could go an hour longer, or maybe they stopped it out, and maybe they could have gone even longer. So that's, we know that carbohydrate feeding works during prolonged exercise. There are many studies that show this. And the reason it works is that you maintain the use of carbohydrate as a fuel. You can see that here. With carbohydrate, you can maintain it. Without carbohydrates, you cannot use enough carbohydrate. That means at some point, the power has to be reduced. There is another, and I'm just going to go through this really quickly, another really interesting finding that we, a long time ago, also in 1997, we did a study where we compared a carbohydrate drink versus placebo. And we asked cyclists to ride 40 kilometers as fast as possible. And before we did the study, my assumption was, well, 40 kilometers is really short. Your body stores of carbohydrate are going to be so large that you're never going to run out in 1 hour. So there shouldn't be any effect of a carbohydrate drink if you take it during that time trial. But we were surprised to find that with the carbohydrate drink, the cyclists were 1 minute faster. The problem was we couldn't explain why. So the next study we designed, we actually infused it directly into the blood. We infused glucose directly into the blood. We compared it with a placebo infusion, saline infusion. And this time, even though we delivered the same or even more carbohydrate, it had no effect on performance. We then designed the third study because that didn't make a whole lot of sense. In the third study, we gave these cyclists a carbohydrate mouth rinse. So they got the same carbohydrate drink, but they were asked not to swallow the drink. So they would just rinse their mouth with it, and then they would spit out this carbohydrate drink. And this time, we found the same 1 minute improvement in 40-kilometer time trial performance. So what that tells us is, because we infused it, it didn't make a difference. It has nothing to do with delivering energy. But when we mouth rinse, and there are receptors in the mouth that detect the carbohydrate and send a signal to the brain, that is the reason why performance may be improved. Now, since then, we have lots of studies, and you can see them all listed here. If these bars are going to the right, it means there was an improvement in performance with a carbohydrate mouth rinse. If they're going to the left, then there was a negative effect. But these effects are not significant. And here you can see lots of studies show that a mouth rinse, just rinsing your mouth with carbohydrate without swallowing any of it, it also works, at least during like higher intensity, shorter duration exercise. And the reason it works is that there is a central effect on the brain. Normally, when we exercise, it starts in the brain. In the brain, we send a signal to the muscle, and the muscle starts working. When the muscle gets tired, it sends signals back to the brain. And it's telling your brain, well, now you have to stop because I'm getting really tired. And your brain tries to tell the muscle, just keep going as long as you can. But at some point, there's so much negative feedback coming into the brain that you fatigue. What we think happens is if you mouth rinse with a carbohydrate solution, then somehow that interferes with all this negative feedback that's coming from your muscle and makes you think, actually, I feel quite good. That is the story for like really high intensity exercise. So carbohydrate works, but it works for a different reason than just providing fuel. In this case, or in longer exercise, it really is about fuel. We store it in the muscle. We have 400 to 900 grams of carbohydrate in the muscle. How much there is depends on how much muscle you have. It also depends on your diet. If you eat a lot of carbohydrate, you can store more. If you have a lot of muscle, you can store more. There's also 60 to 90 grams stored in the liver. That's quite important, but it's a small amount. And then we can deliver carbohydrate through the intestine, of course, when we ingest it during the activity. Now at rest, we only use about 7 grams in an hour. But during exercise, we may use as much as 350 grams in 1 hour, huge amounts. So you can see that very rapidly you would get rid of all of your carbohydrate stores. We also know that if you take carbohydrate during exercise, the more you take, the more your body will use and the more your performance will improve. So that's what this slide shows here. So what we try to do is, like, how can you deliver as much carbohydrate as possible? And the technique we use is a technique where we label the carbohydrate. What that means is a carbohydrate has its name from the word carbon, and it's made out of, like glucose, for example, is made out of 6 carbons. And we can label that carbon by replacing the normal weight carbon with a heavier weight carbon. Normal weight is 12, 13C is the heavier carbon. Now, we can measure that weight of the carbon in the carbohydrate. So if we give a drink here that is labeled with this carbon 13, the drink or the carbohydrate gets digested, it gets absorbed, it gets oxidized in the muscle. And then you exhale the carbon as carbon dioxide. In that carbon dioxide that you exhale, you can measure the carbon 13 again. So if we measure how much carbon 13 we're ingesting, we measure how much is in the expired gases, and we measure the total CO2 production, then we know exactly how much of the carbohydrate that we ingested was utilized. Yeah, so it's a very accurate technique to measure how much of the carbohydrate that is in your sports drink or your gel is actually used during exercise. And what you get is something like this. This is 2 hours of exercise, 120 minutes. And we call that exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. So that is how much of your carbohydrate in your drink or gel is used. And if that is glucose, you can see that it increases the first 60 to 90 minutes and then it levels off. And in this case, it is just over 0.8 grams per minute. Those values will become important in a minute. If we compare that to galactose, another carbohydrate, then you can see that glucose values are much higher here. So I would conclude from that, I would rather have a glucose drink than a galactose drink. Okay? We can then compare different types of carbohydrates. These are just images of different types of carbohydrate that you could have in your drink. The most common ones are maltodextrin, and then glucose and fructose. But even starches like this molecule here could be used in a sports drink. If we look at all the studies and we plot how much of a carbohydrate is used during exercise versus how much was ingested, then you get this figure. And roughly you should see this pattern. Initially, when we ingest more, your body uses more. But there is a limit to how much your body can use. If you ingest more than roughly 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, it doesn't further increase the use of that carbohydrate. So what's the point of taking more than 60 grams an hour? And at that time, this was a publication in the year 2000. At that time, the recommendation was do not take more than 60 grams an hour. But we were curious and we wanted to find out why can your body not use more than 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour? Is this because you cannot ingest more? No. Is it because it's sitting in the stomach? We tested that. The answer was no. Is it because you cannot absorb more? The textbooks were telling us that your capacity to absorb carbohydrate is unlimited. Is it because the liver plays a very important role and maybe stores all this carbohydrate so that you cannot use it in the muscle? We ruled that out as well. And we know from studies where we infused glucose, that your muscle can take up way more than 1 gram per minute and also use more than 1 gram per minute. So we had to question the textbooks, and maybe the textbooks were wrong, and maybe absorption is a limiting factor. And to understand absorption, I'll show you this graph. It's probably the most technical slide that I'm going to show you, but essentially it is very simple. On the left here, you have the inside of the intestine. On the right, you have the blood, and absorption, of course, is taking your carbohydrate, for example, glucose, from the left through the cell, the wall of the intestine, into the blood. That's absorption. So if we look at glucose here, then glucose gets absorbed using a transporter here, this red dot. It's called sodium-dependent glucose transporter 1. It's the difficult name for it, SGLT1. And glucose together with sodium is transported here into the blood. And what we think happens is if you ingest large amounts of glucose, then this transporter becomes saturated. It simply cannot transport more than it is transporting at 60 grams an hour. It's the same as if we were all sitting in one room, we open one door and we say, okay, now let's leave the room as quickly as possible. There's only so many people that can leave the room at a time. And the only way to get more people out of the room is by opening another door. We have another door, and that is GLUT5, which transports another carbohydrate called fructose. So fructose is transported by GLUT5. So maybe if we combined glucose and fructose, we could actually get more carbohydrate into the body. So we designed the studies like that. In this particular study, we compared medium glucose, which was 1.2 grams per minute. So that's more than 60 grams an hour, should be enough to saturate the transporter. We compared it with high glucose, 1.8 grams per minute. That should definitely saturate the transporter. And we compared it with glucose and fructose, where 1.2 grams a minute was coming from glucose and the rest from fructose. These are the results. With the medium glucose, you can see that you use the carbohydrate and it peaks at, well, below 1 gram per minute, similar to what the slide I showed you earlier. If I show you now high glucose, then you can predict already what's going to happen. Hopefully that's what you predicted. Very similar results. And then the third drink had glucose and fructose. Glucose was also provided at a rate that should saturate the transporter. So similar findings, but it also had fructose. And if you add up the glucose and the fructose, then that's the amount of carbohydrate that we're delivering. So that was the first study, first time that anyone showed that you could actually get more than 1 gram a minute into your body, more than 60 grams an hour. So of course, that study then raised a whole lot of questions. Is this the maximum that you can achieve? Or are there combinations that are even better? So we started to do a whole series of studies, and you can see the results here. These gray bars is how much carbohydrate was ingested, and this is the peak of the oxidation that we got, so how much was utilized. And you can see that some combinations like this one, maltodextrin and fructose 2:1, worked really, really well. You can see that like we oxidize 1.5 grams per minute if we ingest like almost 2 grams per minute. And in this case, we ingested 2.4 grams a minute, and then you can see that we can get it as high as 1.75. So just thinking back, that if we provided 60 grams an hour, we would get values that are lower than this. If we provide very large amounts of carbohydrate, we can get up to 1.75 grams per minute. That's 75% more than what we thought was the theoretical maximum, or twice as much as what we would get in a realistic situation. So they're not small differences. This is huge. The question was, of course, does it affect performance? Because there are no medals for how much carbohydrate you can use, but there are medals for how fast you go. And the first indication that we got that this could work is from when we asked people about their ratings of perceived exertion. How hard does the exercise feel? And they received water or glucose and fructose. And with glucose and fructose, they had the lowest ratings of perceived exertion. With water, obviously, they had the highest, and they couldn't even finish the 5 hours of exercise in this case. The other thing that was interesting is after 5 hours, you can see that these cyclists still maintained a reasonable cadence with glucose and fructose, whereas with water and glucose, the cadence had dropped, and that's usually a sign of fatigue. But the real evidence came from this study. In this study, we compared glucose to a placebo in 3 hours, quite hard exercise, and we showed that glucose improved performance compared to placebo by 9.1%. And that's, of course, that's a huge performance improvement, but it's nothing new. We knew that since the 80s, that carbohydrate improves performance compared to placebo. But what was new was that glucose and fructose improved performance a further 8% on top of that. So that's like almost 17% compared to just ingesting water. But a big difference also compared to a regular sports drink. So after that, the question I always got was, well, it's great that you do all these studies in the lab, but I'm used to taking 25 grams an hour, and 90 grams an hour is simply impossible. Can it actually be done? And the answer to that is yes, it can be done. This is some data from Chrissie Wellington when she won the World Championship in 2007. And her intake, if you take it over the whole day, bike, run, and transitions, 775 grams, which is very close to the 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. So even like a relatively small female athlete can take on that amount of carbohydrate. So it is possible. Then we went back to Hawaii in 2009 or 2008 actually to do a study where we looked at carbohydrate intake and finish times, and you can see that plotted here, and you can see there is a negative correlation here, meaning that the lower your time, so the faster your race, the more carbohydrate you take in, or the other way around, the more carbohydrate you take in, the faster your race. These are interesting findings, but we cannot assume causality here. So we don't know if one causes the other. We don't know that the carbohydrate actually made them faster, but it's still a really interesting finding. And I think what it tells me is that, well, first of all, we have this huge range of carbohydrate intake, with some people still taking very little and some people taking enormous amounts. But generally, more carbohydrate correlates with better performance. And then final slide that I'm going to show you. It's not just delivering this glucose and fructose. It's not just delivering more carbohydrate. It is also delaying the onset of fatigue, improving performance. You can also measure that it improves gastric emptying, so it doesn't stay as long in your stomach. It improves fluid delivery. So it's not just energy, it's also hydration that you're improving. And then very important, it also reduces gastrointestinal problems, which is not surprising, at least in my mind. If you are absorbing more, there is less carbohydrate just sitting in your GI tract to cause problems. So that very shortly is a very short summary of many years of research, is sort of what the background is to the NeverSecond product line. And when Bill asked me to, like, what should we have? What should the products be? The first thing is like, well, we should not just talk about the products as a product. And a lot of companies go and today we're going to develop a gel. And then what should the gel do? And then they have a sound plan of what the gel should be, and they develop the gel. And then a few months later, they do have to go through the same process, developing a bar or a drink. And I think if you follow that process, what you don't do is think about how are these products all going to work together? Because at the end of the day, they all end up in your stomach and they get mixed. So I may have, for example, an isotonic gel that once I mix this in the stomach with some solid food, it's not an isotonic gel anymore. So all the claims that you read on the packaging, well, they're out of the window as soon as you combine them with something else in the stomach. So we designed it so that when you combine these products in the stomach, they still work. So every product that you see here will have the same ratio of carbohydrates. 2-to-1, maltodextrin and fructose. So those are also what you saw in the slide, gave us the best results in terms of how much was used and how much was left in the intestine. So that was the basis for the whole product line. And then working with a lot of athletes, the questions you often get is, well, how much should I take? And when I say 90 grams an hour, you can then take out your calculator and say, oh, okay, this gel has 21 grams and this bar has 42 grams. And then another product has 60 grams of carbohydrate. And it becomes quite difficult to calculate it. So we want to make the navigation of it all really simple. So you see on the packaging of NeverSecond, C30. That means in this product, in one serving, you find 30 grams of carbohydrate. So whether it's a gel or a sports drink, if it says C30, there will be 30 grams in one serving. So if I then tell you you need 90 grams an hour, then you know very quickly I need to get 3 servings, whether that is 2 gels and a drink or 2 drinks and a gel. It doesn't really matter. There will be a bar as well soon that is called C30. So that's the whole idea of having a very simple sort of navigation system. You can use all the products together, and we tell you 30, 60, or 90 grams an hour, and then you quickly find the right amounts from the packaging. You can also look at the dots at the top of the packaging units. In this case, it is one unit, and then if I go to another product here on this one, this is the C90 high carb drink, then you can see that this one has 3 units. So those are the 3 options, really, 1, 2, or 3 units. So yeah, going through the products, this is the sports drink that comes in 2 flavors, C30. This is just a different packaging where each serving is in 1 sachet, but the same flavors. This is the high carb drink, where you have 90 grams in 1 sachet. The gels, again, have 30 grams in 2 flavors. And this one now you can see has a plus, and the C30 plus means that it has caffeine. So everything with a plus has caffeine. So this is the espresso flavored gel.
Oscar, to that point, can you maybe just comment a little bit on your perspective on caffeine and how we've built the product, the caffeine levels in certain products? Just explain a little bit about how we've come to the number that we use in terms of dosage.
Yep. Yeah, so if you look at products on the market, then you can find products that have like 20 milligrams of caffeine. You can also find products that have 100 milligrams of caffeine. That is roughly the range. There are a few products that go even higher, but to get an effect of caffeine, you need roughly 3 milligrams per kilogram. So what we did is, instead of having 20 or 25 milligrams per serving, where it would be almost impossible to reach the levels that you need to reach, we went for 75 milligrams. We didn't go for 100 or even higher, because then you have a risk of overdosing, and you would get people who maybe don't understand you shouldn't take 5 or 6 of those gels that contain 100 milligrams. And this is a problem that I still see with a lot of athletes, and they get a lot of stomach problems, don't understand why. Well, it is because the caffeine intake was so high that is very likely the cause of the problems. So that's why we chose 75 milligrams, because you can achieve your goals, but it's very difficult to overdose. All of these products that I've shown you so far, they have 200 milligrams of sodium. Why? Because sodium helps with water absorption. Like studies clearly show this, that if you have sodium in a product, it really helps the water absorption. If you increase the sodium content too much, then it has 2 effects. The first effect is it's really going to affect the taste, and it probably wouldn't taste as nice anymore. But you also increase what we call the osmolality and the density of the product, and that also can have negative effects on gastric emptying. So that's why we stick to 200 milligrams of sodium. There are no other electrolytes in this, which is also an interesting part of the story, because there is no evidence that you need other electrolytes. And I think with all of the NeverSecond product, if there is no evidence for something, we're not going to put it into the product, even though there are all these sort of magical ingredients that sound really great and would probably help to sell it, because people like magical ingredients. We've decided not to go that way. So we only use the things that actually work and have evidence behind it.
I think that's a really important point to really punctuate, is that with, as we've developed the products, and it's one of the biggest, I guess, challenges that Oscar has had over the course of his career, is this constant push from brands to sell you things you don't need. and which don't have any clinical evidence to support improvement or performance gains. So, one of the things that when we're building our products out, we always resort back to clinical studies and testing as the sources of information. And by that, there wouldn't be one, there would be typically multiple sources of studies, so that what we're recommending is a very safe bet. I think electrolytes is a really great example, because I routinely, just from our getting questions from consumers,